A struggling small business owner finds themselves at a crossroads, barely staying afloat. Just when things seem hopeless, billionaire entrepreneur Mark Cuban walks in. What happens next is nothing short of life-changing. Watch as Cuban analyzes the business, shares hard-hitting truths, and delivers an unexpected game-changing move that leaves the owner in tears. This is a must-watch for anyone chasing success in business. James Carter sat in his tiny bakery, his hands shaking as he stared at the final notice in his hand. Final warning: business eviction in 7 days. His dream was slipping away. For 35 years, he had poured his soul into Sweet Haven Bakery, waking up at 4 a.m. every morning, kneading dough with love, serving warm bread to families, and watching kids grow up into adults who brought their own children back. But now, empty tables, bills stacking up. His wife Linda had passed away last year, and ever since everything had fallen apart. He had no strength left. The bank wouldn't help. His son lived miles away, struggling with his own family. The world moved too fast, and James was just an old man with flour-covered hands, forgotten. That night he sat in the dark bakery, staring at the old black and white picture of him and Linda on the wall. Tears streamed down his face. "I failed you, Linda." Then, just as he was about to close up for the last time, the doorbell chimed. A tall man in a hoodie stepped in. James squinted through his tears. Then his heart stopped. It was Mark Cuban. James blinked. Mark Cuban? The billionaire? The Shark Tank legend? The man who could turn anything into gold? Cuban looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the bakery. He took a deep breath, then exhaled. "This place smells like my childhood," he muttered. James wiped his face. What brings you here?" Cuban didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a loaf of bread, squeezed it, and took a bite. His eyes widened. This is real bread," he whispered. James nodded weakly. "I bake everything fresh. No machines, just hands." Cuban nodded, chewing slowly. Then he placed the bread down and leaned against the counter. His face turned serious. "Tell me, James," he said. "How bad is it?" James hesitated. "Bad." His voice broke. "I have 7 days before they shut me down." Cuban didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, nodding slowly, his billionaire brain calculating. Then he looked up. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "You have 2 choices. You can keep crying or you can listen to what I have to say." James swallowed. "I'll listen," he whispered. Cuban smirked. "Good," he said, "because I have a plan." Mark Cuban pulled up a chair, his eyes locked onto James. "First," he said, "let's talk about why you're failing." James clenched his jaw. "People stopped coming." "Wrong," Cuban shot back. "People love fresh bread. They didn't stop coming. You stopped changing." James felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Cuban sighed. "Your bakery is a time capsule. Nothing new, no excitement, no online presence. You're running it like it's 1985, but it's 2025, James." James lowered his head. "I don't know how to do all that fancy online stuff." Cuban nodded. "I figured. But guess what? You don't have to." James frowned. "I don't?" Cuban leaned forward, his voice low and powerful. "You just need one brilliant move. One move that will make this bakery go viral. One move that will bring customers flooding back." James felt his heart race. "But first," Cuban said, "you have to promise me something." James wiped his eyes. "What?" Cuban's face turned dead serious. "You have to trust me. No matter what I say, no matter how crazy it sounds. Can you do that?" James hesitated. Then, he looked at the eviction notice, then back at Cuban, and he nodded. "Good," Cuban said, "because we're about to do something insane." James sat in his bakery, staring at the bills piled up on the counter. Mark Cuban leaned back, arms crossed. His face was unreadable. "James, I've seen businesses come and go. You've got something special, but you're stuck in the past. If you don't change, you'll lose everything. James swallowed hard. He already felt like he had lost everything. His wife, Linda, had always handled the finances. Now, without her, he was drowning. Cuban grabbed a napkin and a pen. "Tell me this, James, why did you start this bakery?" James blinked. Because I love baking." Cuban shook his head. "No, why?" James looked at the old framed picture of Linda on the wall. "Because when I bake," his voice cracked, "I feel like she's still here." Silence. Cuban exhaled. "That is your story, and that's what we're going to use." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Cuban smirked. "People don't just buy bread. They buy stories. They buy memories. And you, my friend, have the most powerful one of all." James felt something inside him shift. Was it hope? Mark Cuban tapped the counter. "Listen to me carefully, James. You're not just selling bread. You're selling a legacy. Your love story with Linda needs to be shared with the world." James hesitated. "But I don't know how to do all that marketing stuff." Cuban smirked. "That's where I come in." He pulled out his phone and started typing. Fast. "First," he said, "we're going to give Sweet Haven Bakery a social media presence. I just texted one of my people. By tonight, you'll have an Instagram, Facebook, and a website." James's head spun. "Instagram? Website?" "Yes," Cuban said. "But that's just step one." He turned his phone toward James. On the screen was a GoFundMe page. "Help James save his late wife's bakery." James's heart pounded. I can't ask people for money." Cuban stared straight at him. "You're not asking for charity," he said. "You're giving people a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. People love supporting a cause, especially one that brings back memories of family, love, and tradition." James felt his throat tighten. Could this actually work? Cuban patted his shoulder. "Just trust me." Mark Cuban lifted his phone. "All right, James, you're about to go viral." James wiped his hands on his apron. "Me? On camera?" Cuban grinned. "Trust me. Just talk like you're telling Linda a story." James took a deep breath. Cuban hit record. The old man stared into the lens, his voice shaky but full of heart. "My name is James Carter. I've been baking for 35 years. My wife Linda and I built this bakery together. She's gone now, but every loaf of bread I bake still has her love in it." He paused, eyes misty. "I don't want to lose Sweet Haven. Not because of money. Not after everything we built. If you've ever had a meal that reminded you of someone you loved, then you know what this place means to me." Cuban stopped recording. He nodded. "That was perfect." Within hours, the video was posted everywhere. Within days, it had millions of views. Then, the donations started flooding in. James watched the numbers climb. $10,000, $20,000, $50,000. He covered his mouth. Tears fell down his face. Linda's bakery wasn't going anywhere, and the world was about to know why. James sat behind the counter staring at his phone. The numbers on the GoFundMe page kept rising. $80,000, $100,000, $150,000. He wiped his eyes. How was this happening? Then the doorbell rang. James looked up. A woman in her 70s stood there, holding a small, crumpled newspaper clipping. She smiled. "You don't remember me, do you?" James squinted. Something about her was familiar. The woman chuckled. 30 years ago, I was a struggling single mother. I had no money, no food. You let me take a loaf of bread for free, every week, until I got back on my feet." James's breath caught in his throat. "I never forgot your kindness," she said, tears in her eyes, and neither did the others. She stepped aside. Behind her was a line of people, stretching down the block. Old customers, strangers who had seen the video, even reporters. They weren't just here to donate. They were here to save Sweet Haven. James covered his mouth, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was something bigger. Mark Cuban walked in, took one look at the line outside, and smiled. "Told you," he said. James was still in shock. I don't understand." Cuban grabbed a chair and sat down. "You gave to the world, James. Now the world is giving back." James's eyes filled with tears. "But we're not done yet," Cuban said, tapping the counter. "We've got momentum, and momentum is everything in business." James frowned. "What do we do next?" Cuban smirked. "We scale." James blinked. "Scale? You think this bakery is just about bread?" Cuban asked. "No. This is about legacy. Your story, your love for Linda, the people who've shared memories here. That's what we're selling." James frowned. "I'm not selling my bakery." Cuban laughed. "No, old man, we're expanding it. We're going to turn Sweet Haven into a national brand." James's hands trembled. "National?" Cuban grinned. "This isn't just a bakery anymore, James. This is a movement." 2 days later, James sat across from Cuban in the bakery. On the table was a contract. James swallowed hard. "What is this?" Cuban leaned forward. "I'm investing $500,000 into Sweet Haven. We're going to open new locations, starting small, but we're keeping the heart of it the same." James's hands shook. Why are you doing this for me?" Cuban smiled. "Because we need businesses like this in the world," he said. "People need places that remind them of home, of family, of love. And I believe in you, James." James wiped his eyes. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Cuban said simply. James picked up the pen. His fingers trembled. Then he thought of Linda. He signed. Cuban shook his hand. "Congratulations, James," he said. "You just became a legend." James sat in his bakery, staring at the contract he had signed just hours ago. His hands trembled as he traced his fingers over the bold letters. Sweet Haven Expansion Project. Partner, Mark Cuban. His heart pounded. He had dreamed of saving his bakery, but this was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. Mark Cuban sat across from him, studying his face. "You're scared," he said. James nodded. What if this doesn't work? What if I fail?" Cuban leaned forward. "James, let me tell you something. Every successful person I know was scared before they made it. But the only real failure is never trying." James sighed. "I'm an old man, Mark. I don't understand business the way you do." Cuban smiled. "That's why I'm here." He stood up, clapping James on the shoulder. "The bakery is staying, James. But we're about to take Sweet Haven to places you never imagined. And trust me, this isn't just about money. This is about making sure Linda's legacy lives forever." James swallowed hard. Maybe, just maybe, this was the right decision. The next morning, James arrived at Sweet Haven before sunrise, like he had for the past 35 years. Except today something was different. As he unlocked the door, he noticed cameras set up outside, a news crew, reporters, and a massive crowd of people waiting. His heart raced. What's happening?" he muttered. Then, Mark Cuban stepped out of a black SUV, smiling. "Good morning, James," Cuban said. "Ready for your first test?" James blinked. "Test?" Cuban nodded. "The story we put online, it's reached millions of people. Now customers are here. Some drove for hours just to taste your bread." James turned toward the crowd, people of all ages, some holding old newspaper clippings, some crying, some carrying their grandkids. A woman stepped forward. "I haven't been here in 20 years, she said. "My mom used to bring me here when I was little. I had to come back." James felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just about business. This was about people. He wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. "All right," he whispered. "Let's get to work." James worked harder than he had in years. Flour covered his hands, sweat dripped from his forehead, and the ovens never stopped burning. The bakery was alive again. Mark Cuban watched from the side, arms crossed. He smiled. But then, disaster struck. Halfway through the day, James noticed something terrifying. They were running out of bread. His heart dropped. The line outside was still long, people were waiting for hours. His hands shook. "I don't have enough," he whispered. "I can't make it fast enough." Cuban walked up to him. "James, listen to me." James looked up, panicked. "I'm letting them down." Cuban shook his head. "No, you're going to teach them." James frowned. "Teach them?" Cuban grinned. "Yes, we're going to bring these people into the kitchen. We're going to show them how Sweet Haven bread is made." James hesitated. "You think they'd want that?" Cuban looked toward the crowd. "James, they didn't come here just for bread. They came here for you." James stood frozen as the idea sank in. "Bring them into the kitchen?" he asked. Mark Cuban nodded. "Yes, let them be part of the story. Show them why this place matters." James swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if this would work, but as he looked at the crowd, people waiting, holding on to old memories, hoping to feel something familiar again, he knew Cuban was right. With a deep breath, he walked to the front of the bakery and called out, "Who wants to learn how to make Sweet Haven's bread?" For a second, silence. Then hands shot up, people gasped, cheers erupted. One by one, they stepped inside. Grandparents, young children, mothers, fathers. James guided them through the process, just like he had taught Linda all those years ago. Flour flew, laughter filled the air, and the warmth of the ovens felt like home. A little girl with pigtails looked up at him. "I want to make bread just like you when I grow up." James's chest tightened. He blinked away tears. This bakery wasn't dying. It was being reborn. That night, after the bakery finally closed, James sat down in his empty shop. His heart was full, but something was missing. He walked to the old wooden shelf and pulled out a faded recipe book. It was Linda's handwriting. "Sweet Haven's secret bread, only made with love." James traced his fingers over her words. His hands trembled. Cuban walked in, noticing the book. "What's that?" James swallowed. "Linda's secret recipe. I haven't made it in years. We used to bake it together only on special occasions." Cuban's eyes lit up. "Then that's it." James frowned. "What's it?" Cuban sat down across from him. "This is how we take Sweet Haven to the next level. We make Linda's bread the signature product, a bread that only Sweet Haven sells, a story baked into every loaf." James felt his heart pound. Linda's bread, shared with the world? For so many years he had been afraid to make it without her. But now, it was time. The next morning, James woke up before the sun. He walked into the bakery alone and placed the faded recipe book on the counter. He took a deep breath. Then, slowly, carefully, he followed Linda's instructions. He measured, mixed, and kneaded just like they used to. Every movement carried a memory. When the bread finally came out of the oven, James lifted it gently. The golden crust, the soft warmth, it smelled like home. Tears welled in his eyes. Then, the door opened. Cuban walked in, followed by a camera crew. James wiped his face. "What's all this?" Cuban smiled. "James, we're about to introduce the world to Linda's bread." A microphone was clipped onto his apron. The cameras rolled. James looked at the lens. He wasn't just baking anymore. He was sharing his love for Linda with the world. And when he spoke, even Mark Cuban's eyes glistened. The cameras rolled. James stood in the center of his bakery, his hands trembling slightly as he held up the fresh loaf of Linda's bread. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is more than bread." Silence. The camera crew leaned in. Mark Cuban folded his arms, watching intently. James swallowed. This is love. This is the recipe my wife and I made together. She wrote it down with her own hands, believing that every loaf should be made with care. She's gone now, but when I bake this, I feel her right here with me. A tear slipped down his cheek. Outside, the live broadcast was playing across thousands of screens. People in coffee shops, families in living rooms, strangers on their phones. And one by one, the tears started falling. A woman in New York clutched an old photo of her mother's bakery. A man in Texas wiped his eyes, remembering the bread his grandmother used to make. James had unlocked something deep, and at that moment, Mark Cuban knew. Sweet Haven wasn't just a business anymore, it was history. The next morning, James woke up to a ringing phone. He groggily picked it up. James Carter speaking. A deep, smooth voice responded. "This is Oprah Winfrey." James nearly dropped the phone. "Oh, Oprah?" "Yes," she chuckled. "I saw your story, and I cried. I haven't cried like that in years." James couldn't breathe. "I want to help share Linda's bread with the world," she continued. "I'd love to feature you on my network and introduce your bakery to millions." James's legs buckled. He grabbed the counter for support. "Are you still there?" Oprah asked. James wiped his eyes. I don't know what to say." Mark Cuban stepped into the room, watching James closely. "Say yes," Cuban mouthed. James took a shaky breath. Yes, Oprah. Thank you." The call ended. James looked at Cuban, still in shock. Cuban grinned. "I told you, James. You're a legend now." Weeks later, the world knew Sweet Haven. Linda's bread was featured on Oprah's Favorite Things. Orders flooded in from all over the world. James couldn't keep up, so Cuban expanded the bakery. The new Sweet Haven wasn't just a store. It was a place of memories, a place where people could come and learn to bake, share their stories, and feel at home. On the opening day of the new flagship bakery, James stood on the small stage, microphone in hand. He took a deep breath. This was it. "I started this bakery with my wife, Linda," he began. His voice broke slightly. "And when she left this world, I thought I lost everything. I was ready to let go." The crowd fell silent, but a stranger walked in. James looked at Mark Cuban, smiling, and he reminded me that dreams don't die. Love doesn't die. Tears streamed down his face. "This bakery isn't just mine anymore, it belongs to all of you." The crowd erupted in applause, and as James turned, wiping his eyes, Cuban whispered, "She'd be proud of you." James looked up, feeling something in the air, and for the first time in years, he could almost hear Linda's laughter. The final words to my viewers: if you felt something in your heart today, don't leave without letting me know. Hit that like button if this story touched you. Comment below. Tell me, did this remind you of someone you love? And don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories to come, stories that will touch your soul. Because at the end of the day, love, kindness, and memories never fade. Thank you for watching.